May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So we recently enjoyed the holidays in which many of us planned or hosted events entertaining family and friends. One of the cardinal rules in planning gatherings is to make sure there is enough for everyone who comes. The general rule in our house is that it's always better to have or make too much rather than to not have enough. It can be awkward and embarrassing if we find that there isn't enough of this or that for our celebration. In our gospel reading today, we have exactly this problem that arises. In Jesus' time of the first century, it was typical that a wedding celebration lasted at least 7 days, and planning for the celebration had to take that into account. It goes without saying that running out of wine during a multi-day wedding celebration would be a disaster and would seem to dishonor not only one's guests, but the bride and the groom as well. In our reading today, Mary becomes aware that they have run out of wine, and she approaches Jesus expecting that he can do something. I'm often amazed by this reading because I'm a little shocked by Jesus' response to Mary. When we hear him say, "What does this have to do with me?" I often imagine that Jesus' response to Mary was met with a motherly glance that didn't quite get translated or included into our text. You know, the motherly side eye. Jesus was using the excuse that it wasn't his time yet, but it was probably that it was a disruption to him. It may have been a disruption to what he thought his timeline of ministry was, or maybe he was just too preoccupied with enjoying the party, enjoying the celebration. But I imagine that the nonverbal response by Mary that didn't quite get picked up in our text today was probably enough to get him to reconsider. And so Mary tells those waiting on the tables to follow whatever Jesus tells you to do. Jesus finally responds to the wedding celebration being out of wine with a revelation of the abundance of God. During this time of Epiphany, this time which our scriptures focus on the revelation of Jesus as being divine, to reveal Jesus as possessing the qualities of God, this reveal sign did not disappoint. Jesus' sign at the wedding revealed an abundance that would be sure to maintain the honor of the bride and groom and keep the celebration going for at least its customary period of time. In the same way, the abundance of God can come to us through these moments of grace, through times of disruption within which we experience grace and experience the presence of God. Often, grace in moments of disruption can come unexpectedly, like when we run out of something at our holiday gathering, and a guest unexpectedly brings something to replenish it. Or like when Jesus revealed an example of God's abundance at the wedding in Cana through turning water into wine. I think that God shows up in these opportunities and moments of grace that come about during these times of disruption. If we pay attention, we can notice these opportunities of grace. We can recognize these moments of God's presence, and our discernment of these moments can often help lead us to discernment and appreciation for our gifts. How do we miss noticing these moments of grace? How do we miss recognizing God in these moments? Well, I think we miss them because we are often focused on ourselves and often focused on a belief that we are self-sufficient. We aren't looking for those times when grace or abundance comes from someplace else, someplace other than ourselves. We can often ignore or miss what is right in front of us, or we can desire to not take the plunge or not get involved. And sometimes we simply don't think that we have anything to offer. But if we look and watch closely, I think we can find grace and find God within times of disruption. And when we experience God, when we experience grace within these moments, they can be opportunities within which we can discern and discover our gifts, opportunities to share our gifts for the good of the community, sometimes unexpectedly, in ways that we could not even imagine. In our reading from 1 Corinthians today, we hear about the variety of gifts that flow from the Spirit, the diversity of gifts that come from the presence of God with us. These times of disruption can often lead to us to discerning our gifts and often can highlight gifts and skills that we previously didn't know existed. I know that we have found grace as a community here at Trinity through the disruption of the pandemic. Within the pandemic, we found that we could worship differently even though we couldn't be together. We developed online worship, which we continue to do in our hybrid worship gatherings. I know that we also found grace as a community when Trinity has experienced the disruption of losing our parking lot tenant. Our investments took a big hit in the market. And as we had to rethink about how to continue financially and how to continue to be Trinity in the midst of the Buffalo community with the financial restraints we are experiencing. We have had to recognize the opportunity of grace, to recognize God as being present with us during this time of disruption. We continue to discern the grace that we find during this time, as we continue to discern how we continue to be Trinity as we look for opportunities for new revenue and new ways we can engage within the Buffalo community. We have been able to discern and highlight the gifts of members of our community as we have embraced financial giving efforts and we have engaged in the Saving Trinity discussions. And there will be more opportunities to discern ways to share our gifts and skills with the community within the upcoming annual meeting in a couple of weeks. Sometimes, as we embrace and live out our baptismal covenant, as we live out our baptismal vows to be and build beloved community, as we strive to continue to reveal God and God's presence in the world through striving for justice, God calls us to be the disruption through which God's presence and God's justice is revealed. I think of Martin Luther King, who talked about a sleepless morning in January 1956 when he was going to sleep and the phone rang. On the other end was a raging voice spewing violent threats and then hung up. At that time, fear gripped him as he feared for his life and the life of his family. There had been moments in which he wanted to give up. He had mobilized people of diverse ethnicities, economic and religious backgrounds to unite for civil equality. But the opposition mobilized too. King spoke to God that night, saying, "I am here taking a stand for what I believe in. But now I'm afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers," he said. "I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. King later described what happened next, that he experienced the presence of the divine as he had never experienced it before. And he explained that it seemed like he could hear a voice that said to him, "Preach the gospel. Stand up for truth. Stand up for righteousness." He knew from this experience then that God would always be at his side. And almost at once, his fears began to go, and he was ready to face anything. For King, that voice and presence of God gave him the strength and courage to continue to lead the people in the quest for civil equality, to provide disruption against the system of white power that sought to dominate and oppress people of color, to provide disruption through which grace, the presence of God, and God's justice could be experienced. We are standing here today at the brink of a new administration, with the inauguration of a new president. We are unsure of the disruption which may be experienced, or the disruption which might be called upon, through which God's presence and God's justice might be made manifest and experienced. We are called by that same voice that spoke out to King to preach the gospel, stand up for the truth, stand up for righteousness. So what if? What if we could notice these opportunities of grace? What if we were able to notice that these moments often find us discerning new gifts or new ways to use our gifts? Well, I think we need to be open to find grace where it finds us. I think we can then embrace moments of grace as times of discernment and growth, times for discerning and responding in such a way that brings forth our gifts, sometimes unexpectedly. I know that it is through times of disruption that we experience grace, that we can experience God's presence, and through the grace and presence that we experience, we can experience growth and transformation, not only for ourselves, but for the world as well. So I ask myself, and perhaps you ask yourself as well, am I open to opportunities of grace and to what they are helping me to discern? Am I hearing the voice that spoke to King so that I can respond by living my baptismal vows and know that God is always with me? Am I listening to Mary's prompting to follow whatever Jesus tells me to do? What if?